Welcome everyone to the One Sky Overall Community Speaker Series brought to you by Renison University College and the Waterloo Public Library. Renison University College, affiliated with the University of Waterloo, was established in 1959. Students of Renison earn University of Waterloo degrees, and Renison offers undergraduate degree programs in social development studies, and postgraduate degrees include Bachelor of Social Work and Master of Social Work. Renison also offers classes for undergraduate students in applied language studies, East Asian studies, studies in Islamic and Arab cultures, and religious studies. Renison also has a wide selection of community and professional education programs. Renison's founders established as the college's motto as One Sky Overall. Renison believes deeply in contributing to a world in which social justice, diversity, and equity are not aspirations but realities, and our programs reflect this view. So thank you for your interest in this series. We've planned tonight's event to be a conversation about some of the most common myths or misconceptions and general questions people have about relationships. And we hope there will be something illuminating for everyone. Nancy already introduced my co-speakers today, Uzma and Toni, and I'll say we welcome questions at any time. If related to the topic at hand, we'll aim to answer them as they pop up, and for questions about topics we haven't yet covered, we'll just save those to the end. Okay, so we're going to start tonight talking a little bit about online dating. And some of the some maybe common concerns, conceptions people have about online dating. In particular, we often hear about online dating being inferior to real life dating. Although more and more people are meeting this way, you hear many horror stories, and many people, find it disappointing, frustrating, feel hopelessness in the process. So why is that? What are some advantages and disadvantages? So I'll speak a little bit to that. And one thing we know is in some surveys more recently, it seems that it's almost like one of the most common ways now that people meet their partners, and especially folks who are in what are kind of considered thin markets. So they're maybe in rural settings, maybe they're older, divorced, and they're older, maybe looking for same-sex partnerships, where it might be a little bit harder to find someone that would match with them. Even more so, lots of more access for online dating. And that's one of the big advantages, having that access. But while that's also an advantage, it seems that can cause problems for people as well. There's so much access, there's so many profiles when you're browsing any of these sites. How do you possibly narrow it down? And people can often get in more of a like kind of a rejection mindset when you're like swipe, 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 sort of sifting through, really looking for the right person. People often can be a little bit more judgmental, be more focused on the negative than they would be if, say, a friend tried to set you up with their coworker and said, hey, what about this person, right? And where you maybe go in with a little bit more of a positive mindset. One of the other issues I think that really comes up there is when people end up meeting someone in person, you get what I like to call the good on paper phenomenon. Okay, so you see this profile, you see the person's like, oh, they like to travel and they read science fiction and they care about the environment just like me. And then you meet in person and you're like, yeah, no, this isn't gonna work. And at best, it just doesn't, you don't really click. And at worst, that's where you insert horror story here, some incredibly awkward, uncomfortable, or disrespectful, any number of things. And I think, people can come away with that sort of feeling like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I pick someone? And I think what the science would suggest is that nobody's really good at picking someone. That when we look at, tons and tons of research on how you predict whether a couple will make a match and have a successful relationship, people's individual histories, personalities, attitudes, that predicts very little. And that's really what you're getting on that on-screen profile, right? And what's more important in a quality relationship or predicting a satisfying relationship is how people interact, how you communicate, how you solve problems, how you support each other, even circumstances that you experience as a couple, stressors, your social network support, things like that. And so just in general, we're not very good at being able to tell just from those profiles. And so I think, really giving people a chance beyond just, just reading the profile and expecting, and being able to kind of go in with an open mind. Toni, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, Denise, thanks. Actually, I did a little research study with an honors thesis student of mine on online dating a few years back. And what really struck me from the results, they were mostly Southwestern Ontario young adults, so university age, college age folks. And what struck me about young people at this time, I think we gathered the data in 2017, so not that long ago, is that there was a lot of stigma around online dating, even though the numbers, the research is showing that, young people age 18 to 24, the numbers have tripled in terms of how many young people are using online dating, but there was still stigma. And so these ideas about meeting face to face or in person is more organic, is more natural, more genuine, dynamic. These were some of the words that participants were using. And their values and beliefs was really interesting. They talked about online dating as unconventional, as artificial or plastic or fake. These were the young people who had no interest in online dating ever. So how much do these values and beliefs shape their decisions to not online date? Whereas a large portion of the sample either were online dating or did online date or were open to online dating. And when we asked them, well, why would you online date? Like, what would draw you to online dating? Overwhelmingly, we heard that it's a process of screening and discernment. So they could get a sense of, even though it's just on paper, is there something here that grabs my attention, right? Are there some overlaps? Because if you're a camping person and I'm not a camping person, swipe next one, because I'm not going to spend all my dates in mosquito-ridden territory with you. They were able to discern a bit, and they really liked that. And they liked how easy it was, right? Where they could just go online and take a look. So that really struck me, that there was this ease factor, there an excitement factor, and the sheer number of options. That is also what's problematic about online dating, as you mentioned. So many options. How do you settle? How do you decide, right? Who am I going to chat with? And then who am I going to meet in person? But what we're seeing, though, is in this group, anyway, about 500 people responded. Many of them talked about really positive experiences with online dating and finding love and finding relationships. So I know that the stigma, the stereotype says, "Ooh, you don't want to find someone online. Like, what's wrong with you? You must be desperate if you're going online." Well, look at us. Everything's online. Like, this is not a sign of desperation any longer, if even it was at one time. But they're finding what they want in a partner. So that's really, really hopeful, right? I love that part of it. It's very exciting to see that. And some of the folks who said they would never online date, their reason was because they were already in a relationship that they believed would last the long haul. So.
Yeah, I've seen that change too. When I taught a relationships course first in 2010, and the students were all like, online dating, that's for desperate, lonely, weird people. And then I taught the course again last year, and these, all the folks in their early 20s, and they're like, yeah, well, I'm on my phone all the time. Why not? Right? Exactly. If they weren't already in a relationship. Exactly. I see here a question coming up. What are the statistics with finding love on online dating? Are there studies on the length of the relationship, and how many of these participants that said they found love are male versus female? I don't know if you know. Do you?
I don't know the stats on how many who find love from online dating relationships. I don't know what the numbers are around that. But that's a good question around respondents, and did they identify as being like, what gender did they identify as? And I don't have that data handy, but I'm recalling it was qualitative. So they were text responses. So they would say, why? We would ask why, and they would type in their answer. And I remember seeing a range of people who identified that they were men or that they were women. I saw a combination. I do remember, though, the ones who identified experiencing something unexpected in online dating in a negative way were predominantly people who identified as women or female, that they were more likely to report having difficulties, usually around unwanted sexual advances in particular.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and statistics, I mean, the only other one I'm familiar with too is a recent study in the US with a fairly large sample that indicated it was about, of heterosexual couples in this case, was about 39% had met online. So quite a number there. In terms of are they more or less successful? Again, as I kind of said, it really depends on what happens after you meet. The mode of meeting doesn't really determine that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and next topic, as Toni is going to start with and telling us a little bit more about LGBTQ plus relationships and some thoughts on that. Are these relationships tend to be vastly different, similar? What do you have to offer there?
Well, do we have, what, 6, 7 hours to talk about this? No, we don't. So first, a qualifier. This is not my area of research. When I teach courses on relationships, I teach about a diversity, of relationships, and I'm drawing on material that I've pulled from accessing conferences, and I try to go to sessions that talk about relationships that are diverse, other than heterosexual relationships. But first, it's really important, I think, to be clear that language is constantly changing, and I do not profess to be on the cutting edge of staying on top of all the language. I do my best, but so being clear about the differences between sex, sexuality, and gender. And when I use these terms, and when I talk about gender, I'm referring to femininity or masculinity, androgyny, typically terms that we would use to describe kind of aesthetic practices. Sex is more biological, anatomy, so male, female, intersex. And then there's a term that I'm becoming fond of. Sari Van Anders has offered this term, gender sex, and that's around woman, man, non-binary, terms that we would typically use to refer to the whole person and how they self-identify. So when we're looking at LGBTQIA2S plus folks, there are many similarities and also some differences between their experiences in relationships and the experiences of cisgender men and women, cisgender heterosexual folk. And one of the issues, though, that I think stands out most for me is around socialization and gender scripts. So historically and today, we have been trained to look for certain things in people who are men and people who are women. And that means that they act in certain ways, they present in certain ways, and this translates into how they are in relationships. And, we talk about men as pursuers in relationships. They make the first move, they ask for date, they're more sexually aggressive, they want sex earlier. And we talk about women as being historically the gatekeepers. They're the ones who are supposed to say no, they're not supposed to want sex, at least not right away, and things of that nature. So keeping this in mind, because there's this idea of men as needing sex and wanting sex all the time, and that's how men are trained. When we're looking at gay men in relationships, the way they're socialized as men also factors into how they may approach relationships. We also know that we devalue femininity in men. So when men express needs for intimacy and connection and belonging and show emotions, there are negative consequences to that. We don't have a lot of space for men to share those kinds of things, to want love openly and search for intimacy. And my understanding from colleagues who are doing research with gay men in particular, that this is really problematic, that we have this expectation that they're not interested in intimacy and long-term relationships, that all they want is sex. So we imagine that that they're completely oriented by, when is the next sexual experience. And look, folks, there are folks who are oriented to wanting casual sex or regular sex, whether they're heterosexual or queer, it really doesn't matter. And there are folks who are interested in long-term committed relationships, again, wherever they fall in terms of gender sex. So there's many similarities, but also some of those differences in terms of socialization that there's less space for gay men in particular to express some of those what we would historically call more feminine kinds of characteristics, the emotional expressiveness, the need for intimacy and belonging, and things like that. At the end of the day, I mean, in all my clinical work, communication is the foundation of all relationships, right? And ensuring that you're on the same page, that you're both are interested in a casual sexual relationship, or you're both are interested in looking for a longer term, committed, intimate sort of relationship. So I'll pause there. Denise, if there's anything that you'd like to share.
I was going to add on that communication piece. I was thinking as well of how there's some advantage, I think, for same-sex couples who don't have traditionally defined gender roles within a relationship to fall back on, that it really forces a deeper communication and more careful division of labor, which conversations that we all should be having, you know, when that we shouldn't necessarily be falling on those expectations anyway. And just a piece about the stigma too, and how that might affect things. And I know one particular study looked at the stigma these same-sex or same-gender couples might face that's either part of from their social network, so family and friends, or from larger society. And we know even where there's been positive changes in society, some people are still within cultural certain groups or religious groups where those relationships are frowned upon. And it was really more so the social network stigma that had more of a difference. So regardless of what the larger society says or thinks or accepts, if your family and friends are not with you on that, unfortunately, that's a really tough to make a relationship work in that kind of environment.
Yeah. And actually, Denise, if I could just add one thing, among folks who are non-binary, again, I did a small research study on folks who are non-binary and how they navigate relationships. And bottom line, communication was the most significant factor in the successful negotiation of the relationship. They don't have those stereotypical gender roles to go by because they identify as non-binary. And so what they talked about doing was negotiating between them in the relationship. What's going to work, what's going to fit, who am I, who are you, and what are our wants and needs and desires. So communication came sort of top on the list.
Right, right. Toni, I see a question here. I don't know if you're able to answer this. Do you feel that dating apps are not friendly or not geared towards people who identify as asexual?
Oh, yeah. I think there's something to be said for that. I don't think that apps do a great job at all of folks who are asexual. I think there's a lot of room for improvement in that area. Thank you for that question. You are absolutely right. I think that people need to be sort of, I don't know, more strategic in how they use the functions, right? To really be clear about what they're looking for, what they want in someone else, and to be able to read between the lines in terms of what other people are looking for as well. So no, I don't think they're super friendly, and I think it's time for a change.
Okay, I do see a couple other questions here, but I'm going to try and move on for a bit and then come back to some of those later. So next item is conflict. I'm going to start with Uzma. Is conflict in a relationship a sign that things aren't going well?
All right, thanks, Denise. So I think what I'm going to do with this question, and I love this question, and it relates to my area of research as well, is first go over the short answer and then go over a slightly longer answer. Like Toni said, we don't have the amount of time that we would like to go into the individual research studies, but the short answer is absolutely, conflict is not a sign that your relationship is doomed. And in fact, conflict can very much be part of a very healthy relationship. And so now let's go into the longer answer with this. So it's kind of inevitable that two people in a long-term relationship or even short-term relationship, but particularly in long-term committed relationships, are going to run into places where their goals, their desires, their preferences are going to be misaligned with each other. And this is true for all close relationships, but in our intimate relationships, we're so interdependent. So one partner's behavior, their beliefs, their attitudes, their preferences exert a really incredible level of impact on the other partner. And so what's interesting is that the relationship research field has gone through a lot of different changes in how it views conflict and how it views adaptive conflict versus maladaptive conflict. And so there are two dimensions I often turn to, because a lot of literature supports that when two partners disagree with each other, the tactics they use to negotiate that disagreement, we can think of them around positive or negative. So more, and this will be familiar to most people. So like more constructive types of communication versus more hostile and more negative communication. And another dimension that people may be less kind of tuned into is the idea of more kind of active, engaged types of communication versus more passive communication. So you come across a difference between you and your partner and you decide, you know what, I'm going to pick my battles. I'm going to let this one go. And I love them. I'm still going to be here. I'm loyal to this relationship. I'm going to keep working in positive ways. Well, that would be an example of like a constructive but passive approach. And a constructive and active approach would be more like, you know, engaging with them, talking with them. And a constructive and a destructive and passive approach would be something which we call like passive aggressive. And then we have like kind of hostile, angry. Generally, active, constructive approaches work the best. But I think there's a really important caveat here, that flexibility is important. That there are times when rather than kind of engaging, it's better to let things go. And so I think being judicious in which battles you pick and what you let go of is really important. And there's a study that I saw recently, and that talked about how there is even a place for more negative behaviors to occur. And this isn't a single study. There's more research that's coming out of this, that sometimes like if your partner is behaving really badly and you need to set a boundary and say that, you know, this violation has occurred. And so in that, a more emphatic, angry response may be very reasonable. So I think flexibility to me is the key in this response, and that it's hard to say good behavior, bad behavior, but conflict, absolutely, we think is part of relationships. It's how you navigate it. So anything, Denise, you would add to that?
Yeah, I think those are all points. I was thinking about that work too, on the direct and indirect and or constructive or destructive. And also I think sometimes people have questions about where, and as you were kind of alluding to, where and when it's appropriate to show anger, or what kind of anger. And I think you made the point too, that particularly when there is a severe problem in the relationship, if you don't communicate your anger, your partner may not get the message that this is really problematic and needs to change. And then it can always be about, you can always have a choice about how, I say you have a choice about how to express your anger, although in the moment of feeling angry, it certainly doesn't feel like that, I think. But if you have some time to reflect on it, you know, there's a difference between, you know, I feel really angry. I'm surprised that this happened. Can you help me understand your thinking here? Versus, what's wrong with you? How could you say that? Really this sort of contemptuous, really kind of critical, sort of almost insulting or way of speaking to your partner. And once you get into that, and you get your partner's defenses up, the conversation often goes nowhere. And it's like, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with you? Right? And you get this sort of negative cycle back and forth. And so really trying to kind of step back and navigate that. I think, you know, I don't know what you think about this, Uzma, but, you know, sometimes people say you should never go to bed angry. And I think, no, sometimes you're not ready to talk about it right away. And if you're having a conflict at night, go to bed angry and then talk about it in the morning when you've had a chance to refresh, have some rest, get a little bit of perspective on it. I think that's often better than reacting out of anger.
I totally agree with you, Denise. I wish that would be just put to bed.
Yeah, I see Toni nodding furiously there. Okay. So question here regarding conflict. For partners that break up following a conflict, is it worth trying to rekindle the relationship, or does that form a chasm in the relationship going forward? Yeah, that's a tough one. I've had this conversation with students a lot too, who, you know, sometimes like get into these relationships that are really back and forth. And yeah, when is it appropriate to, or when is it a good idea to get back to rekindle? Yeah, any thoughts on that, Uzma or Toni?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is a bit of a cop-out, but it really depends. I think it depends on the severity of the conflict. It depends on, like, all relationships have these kind of perpetual conflicts. These areas where partners recognize, like, I don't know if we're gonna really come to a place of total agreement. But I think if that remains active, it's like it's actively bothering you versus you've recognized it, come to terms with it, or accepted it, or you found a solution to it. You know, so I think if it's the perpetual problem is unsolvable, but you can't come to peace with it, and you can't get support to find a way out of it, I find that that is one indicator, not the only, of that it might be really hard for you to make the relationship work. And especially I think the other part, I'm sorry about the stories, the other part to keep in mind is, like, I think when people have problems with a partner's personality, you know, I think those are long-standing ways in which people behave, and I think they're hard for people to change. So, I mean, if it's behavioral issues, we can say things like, oh, I'd like you to, you know, be more responsive, be more supportive. But I think if it's like, I want you to become an extrovert when you're really an introvert, that's a losing battle. So
Yeah, that's one of those things where we can't really resolve, but just learn to manage and live with. Yeah. Toni, did you have anything to add there?
Not much, aside from, you know, when the relationship ended, did the folks in the relationship feel like they gave it their, you know, best effort? Did they see a counselor? Not because I'm a therapist that I would recommend that, but yes, also I am, so I do. Sometimes I find in my clinical work that people use the time to discern whether or not they can make things good enough that they want to be together. So before they break up, they want to make sure they've tried everything. So I guess that's the only other layer I would wonder would be, do you feel like you gave it a really good shot and that the problems are insurmountable? If you feel that they're not, and it might have ended abruptly, then maybe revisiting it with some support maybe would be an option.
Okay. I see there's a question here about resources to address these communication issues during conflicts. I wonder if that's something that we can pop in the chat a little bit later if anyone has anything, or pass on through the library if we can point people to.
Yeah, I think there are some really good books on this, and so you know, we can even provide some information to the library to pass on to the attendees of this talk.
Okay, great. Okay, so moving on, and it's kind of related to what we've been talking about conflict and putting effort in. A question about this idea of soulmates. Is there one perfect person for you? And if you find them, everything is easy. And I would say to that, well, what psychologists are often more concerned with, not is there one perfect person for you, but what are the consequences of believing that there is one perfect person for you or not? And how does that change the way we approach relationships? And so there's some research looking at whether people identified as what they call a destiny theorist, that there's some person you're destined to be with, that making a relationship work is simply a matter of finding the right person. And if you do, everything falls into place. And in contrast, there's a different kind of a way of thinking about it, of growth rather than destiny. So in growth, your belief is a relationship works if you put the work in and you overcome challenges, and even seeing challenges as a way to bring people together. And so what can happen then when people have this theory of destiny or soulmate if they meet someone and things are a little bit bumpy at the start, that can really put them off. And so they conclude, okay, this is obviously is not the right person for me, and move on quickly. I mean, I say that at the start, but I've even seen this happen in marriages where people ran into trouble with their marriage and said, oh, I guess I was wrong. This isn't my soulmate. And as we've just been saying, obviously conflict is not a sign that you're not with a person who's good for you. It's inevitable in any long-term relationship. So then people who have more of a growth theory are more inclined to keep putting that effort in, and use more constructive coping strategies for problems that arise. But that said, the growth theorists, although they use more adaptive coping strategies, I wouldn't necessarily argue that that's a better way of better belief than believing in destiny, because while people with this destiny belief might give up too quickly, people really high with these growth beliefs might needlessly put effort into dead-end relationships or not leave relationships that are unhealthy for them. So I think at the very least, it's important for people to reflect on their own beliefs and also really understand their partners, right? Because people are often baffled by, why is my partner just like abandoning this conflict? We could work this out. And it's like, well, what do they believe about what conflict means and how to work that out? Toni, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all your points, Denise, absolutely. And I'm not, I think that the idea of a soulmate certainly is problematic in a number of ways, because it sets us up for expecting our partner to be our everything. And all of that is easy. We're all human, right? We have our faults, we have our strengths, we have our areas for growth. We're not all great at everything. I can't be your basketball buddy, your scuba diving buddy, your, this, that, and the other thing. Like they're not all me, but there has to be enough that keeps you together. As an identity researcher, I always look at things through an identity lens as well. And one identity theory says that we learn about who we are, we create who we are through interactions with other people. So we sort of see ourselves through them. So when we're with people that we're intimate with and close with, we learn things about ourselves through being with them. It doesn't mean that the process is easy, and it doesn't mean they're the only person that we'll learn about ourselves through. It means that at this point in time, there's something to be gained here. Whether that lasts or doesn't last is another story. Also in my clinical work, I mean, I've worked with so many folks who have had multiple deep loves. So I cannot believe that there is only one love and one person for every person. It's just different times in our life. We find ourselves with maybe different people, that there are things to be learned and gained from those experiences. And learning about ourselves is part of it. What are our boundaries? What's good for us? And when do we need to, as you said before, draw that line and say, yeah, no. This is not how I want to be. This is not who I am becoming. This is not how I want to live my life. These are not my values. I deserve more than this. We're not a good match. Yeah. Sometimes people may seem like a good match at one point in their lives and then shift and change at another point, not so great anymore. So.
Yeah, I also think of it a little bit as not about finding the right one, but finding someone who's a relatively good match, and then making them the one, right? There's a choice there, and you choose to make this person the one, and then you put the work in to developing that relationship. And I see there's a question/comment here about how to address the expectation of chemistry or sparks on a first date. It seems to me this is something that develops from a relationship as opposed to Cupid hitting you with an arrow. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some people will feel those sparks, but those can develop over time. Yeah. Any thoughts to that, Uzma or Toni?
Yeah, there is some research that speaks to the idea of whether people see sexual desire as something fixed, sexual desire for another person, and sexual chemistry as something that is fixed versus something that can evolve and change over time. And so, for example, if we think about arranged marriages, it's very much based on the idea that you can make it work. But I think people vary, even in Western contexts, very much on to the extent to which they feel that sexual chemistry is either a, absolutely present, absent phenomena versus it can grow and it has an impact. I don't think there's an answer about which one is right, but how you construe it influences how much time you give, how much effort you make.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
If I could just add the one other piece, and that is if that sexual chemistry and connection is not important for everyone. So folks who are asexual can be in relationships with others, but that sexual chemistry is not even on the radar, right? Because it's just not important. And for others, it's on a hierarchy. How important is sexual chemistry? It's not, there's lots of ways to be intimate with people that are not sexual. So there's a lot of diversity in terms of how people do relationships and where chemistry fits for them, whether it's on the first date or later on.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay, next question, or kind of myth or misconception, you tell us. If couples go to counseling, they're really in trouble. Couples counseling is a last resort. What do you think about that, Toni?
Well, when people come into my office, it sometimes feels like they think it's a last resort. But does it mean they're really in trouble? Not necessarily, no. What it means, I think for me, in terms of how I've experienced people doing this work, is that they're ready for a change. They've identified that the relationship isn't as good as it could be, or it isn't as good as they want it to be, and they're wanting to strengthen it. Or maybe determine again whether they're going to stay together or not stay together. Sometimes they're coming in to talk about how to end the relationship because they want to end it on good terms. They're co-parenting and things like that. So I see going to counseling as a very hopeful stage in a relationship. Because you're committed enough to the person or the people. It could be that you're in a relationship with multiple people, that it's an opportunity to be an active agent in your own future and in your destiny, right? And work on making that work together so that it's fulfilling for all of you and not just for one person. And at the end of the day, what I find, and I know I'm going to say this word again, you're going to get tired of hearing this word from me, communication. Most folks who come for relational counseling, at the end of the day, they want to learn how to communicate better with their partners. And the two things I would say that are really foundational in communication around relationships, one is vulnerability, for you making yourself vulnerable when you communicate. And the second is for the listener, for the other folks to listen openly with the intent to understand. They don't have to agree with how other folks are feeling, but they need to be committed to understanding, right? And then they can work on some solutions together. So no, on the opposite, I don't think that when folks go to counseling, it's because their relationship is in big trouble. I think it's a really hopeful, agentic decision to make.
Yeah, thank you. Uzma.
Yeah, I totally agree with Toni on that. I think that counseling can benefit people at different stages of distress in their relationship. And, you know, for example, in my work, I see both individual clients and couples. And sometimes individuals ask me, they're like, you know, what should we go for counseling? And I think prevention or early intervention is so much better. So it doesn't mean that if somebody's highly distressed that counseling is not suitable for them, because a counselor may be able to help them. But sometimes when distress has lasted for like 10, 20 years, one person's already kind of one foot out the door. And so then it's not clear whether, you know, counseling is being used really to work on the relationship, or one person is wanting to exit the relationship. And that's not so unusual, but I think I just encourage people to go in early because it can just clarify your values. It can help you, if you're strong, to get stronger in areas that may be difficult or challenging for you to talk about on your own. So I see a lot of value in it.
Yeah, I see a question here with regards to couples therapy. Do you find that one party has usually given up and wants to find validation and the other thinks the relationship is salvageable? sounds like from what you've been saying, it's really a mixed bag.
It's a mixed bag. Like there are situations when, it really, there's a hidden agenda, and the hidden agenda is that with the help of the therapist, one partner may want to exit the relationship, and it's too difficult for them to do on their own. But in a lot of other instances, I think both partners are really wanting change, and they're just feeling stuck and hopeless on their own and not able to figure it out.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, there's also some questions here. I don't know if you can answer from your experience, about for folks on the spectrum, whether dating, communication, conflict, any thoughts on that? Like what, I think there's a few questions here. There's a lot of questions. I'm trying to get through them all.
Yeah.
Folks on the spectrum for dating and handling conflict in particular seem to be the ones that came up here.
I don't have a really specific answer, because I think that the therapist in me would want to ask more questions to determine exactly what it is this person is wondering about. At the end of the day, folks who are on the spectrum can certainly have healthy, fulfilling relationships. So they're not excluded by any stretch. Also, people have different experiences, right? When they're on the spectrum or neurodivergent or whatever language is appropriate, that looks different for different people. So I think that I would really need a bit more individual, I guess, information to respond to that. Uzma, maybe you have something else to offer?
I think there are now therapists who are starting to specialize in terms of having more information, be able to develop like communication training programs that can help individuals on the spectrum be able to express themselves and have the partner understand. So often I think the label or getting diagnosed can be really helpful for people, and I think communicating about it openly and directly. Now I have heard from colleagues who are therapists that what they found is that when somebody who is on the spectrum, they're in a relationship and they're experiencing a lot of conflict with their partner, but then there's a reason that they understand after receiving a diagnosis of why those issues are arising, or how their way of interpreting their partner's behavior is impacting their well-being. So when those things are out in the open, it becomes much easier to talk about them and discuss them. And I think more and more there is more specialization that's coming out, but unfortunately probably you would have to look, and not all therapists would be suitable. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I see someone said, should counseling only be for couples in distress? Do you recommend counseling to couples who are not experiencing any significant conflict or distress? And it sounded like, Uzma, you were saying, yeah, even as a proactive way of, we could all benefit from improved communication.
Yeah, I don't think counseling is for everyone or needs to be, but I think if there are, because you can get to a point of like being in stuck places, but not feeling necessarily highly distressed in the relationship. So I would say if people are feeling like their own communication skill, or the way Toni was describing that really appeals to me, that either one or both partner is not able to be really vulnerable. And there's some blocks to that intimacy and vulnerability. And so I think even without being distressed, seeing some early signs and saying, how do we work on it, can be really helpful.
Okay.
I'm with Uzma on that.
Okay. Okay, I'll try and return to some of these questions a little bit later if we kind of get through some of the topics, more of the topics we wanted to cover. So one, I know this is a bit of a controversial or challenging one, about watching porn. So will watching porn ruin your sex life with your partner? Guys, you've seen many kind of media articles that would suggest this is the end of the world. Others would say, no, there's a place for that in relationships. Uzma, what do you have on that?
And Denise, you've kind of pointed to the main issue here. This is such a politicized and polarized topic that like we need like cool heads to prevail. So I'm going to go into the data a little bit here. So talk to you guys about what the evidence suggests about pornography use. And there has been like an explosion in research on this topic in the last 15 years. And part of the reason is that how available pornography is, what the high rates of consumption are across the world. And so, I mean, there's a big, like among pornography researchers, people talk about how in COVID, that's how a lot of people are getting through self-isolation as well, getting through isolation. So let's look at what the research says. So first, what researchers started to do was to look at some correlational studies when people started to think about like, how is this affecting relationships, good ways, bad ways. And what the evidence suggested at that time from those correlational studies is that women's pornography use is not associated with kind of lower sexual or relationship satisfaction for themselves or their partner. So studies either found that there was no effect of women's use or possibly positive effects. And for men, the studies found that there was, the higher the frequency of men's pornography use, there seemed to be somewhat lower relationship and sexual satisfaction for men themselves, as well as their partners. But these are correlational studies, and a very plausible explanation is that people who are unhappy, men who are unhappy in their relationships, were using pornography as a way of coping with that dissatisfaction. And one very quick caveat here is that most of this research is heteronormative, and that's a really important limitation of this work. And then researchers started looking at the longitudinal studies, and the longitudinal studies are finding a similar pattern from the correlational studies. But I want to just highlight 3 important limitations that we should take into account. First, even for men, these effects are small. So it does not mean that for most people who use pornography, there's going to be a negative effect. That for some people there will be, but that that effect generally is not a very strong effect. Secondly, there are a lot of other factors that play a role in this equation, and I'm going to kind of talk about them very briefly. And thirdly, a lot of this research has been very harm focused. So it's been looking for problems. So it hasn't been investigating enough. What are the ways in which pornography may help like rekindle desire in relationships? It may give people an outlet for exploring things that they may not have been able to explore with their partner, and in that way benefited the relationship. So I would say we need to better understand the relationship context of pornography use. I don't think pornography use in itself is likely the culprit. It's likely going to be other things such as trust and variable that Toni talked about, communication between partners. If people, like one of the studies we did, we found that all the topics that men tend to avoid talking about with their partner, we had like 14 relationship topics. Number 1 to avoid the most is pornography use. So I think if we find negative effects, is it because of pornography use, or is it because people are not feeling safe discussing these issues in their relationship? So there's a lot more research that needs to be done. And I think this field is at the intersection of so many interesting law, ethics, psychology, sexualities, feminism. So I think there are a lot of stakeholders. But I'm really looking forward to some of the work that continues to be done, and it clarifies this relationship further. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Uzma.
Yeah.
Toni.
Yeah, I mean, I can't follow that. Uzma, that was fantastic.
I wrote it all down.
You're awesome. I guess the only piece that I would wonder about, I know there is some literature on couples using pornography in their sex life, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, it comes back to communication and how can this be relationship promoting for all members of the relationship, right? So it's consensual, it's negotiated, it's done together, it's for the purpose of the relationship in whatever ways. So yeah, I think that I understand that there's research that suggests that that certainly is possible. I think there's also the other piece that there isn't just one type of porn, right? Pornography is very diverse.
Yes.
And so the other question would be, what kind of pornography, sounds really, when I say it in short form, it sounds even harsher. what kind of pornography are you interested in and why? And does a partner's response have something to do with the kind of porn that's being viewed, or just porn overall? And we do know that pornography, represents perhaps not, lack of a better way to say it, but not accurate representations of both the average body as well as what sexual activity looks like between people, right? I mean, this is on camera, it's for show, everything is angled. And so people can feel like it sets up expectations that they just can't live up to, right? Then there's also, I had students who did a project on different kinds of porn, and they looked at lesbian erotica, I think that the genre was called. And it was very relationally focused. It was very intimate, very, all of those things. And I'm watching it, I'm thinking, and this is porn? This is great, and, but contrasted very differently to some other kinds. So that's the only other piece that I would add, is also what kind are we talking about here?
It's so important, Toni. Like, I think, we're starting to get these nuances in the research, and it'll be so important to have that. Like, is what kind of porn? Are people using it together versus alone? What's the pattern of use? How much is it a hidden and secretive activity? So all of these factors are incredibly important.
And are you rejecting your partner in favor of porn? Right? Because then there's that rejection piece. Well, are we responding to the rejection or the fact that you're looking at porn? Right? So, yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Next question, or sort of myth, and some may have heard this old saying, you have to love yourself before you can love someone else. Is that true? What does that even mean? A lot of my research has looked at people with low self-esteem and with their experience in relationships. And I should mention that people with low self-esteem aren't necessarily very negative or disliking of themselves. They're often, those on the lower end are more uncertain. And so they seek a lot of reassurance. Am I worthy? Am I valuable? Does this person really care about me? What does this behavior mean from this person? And that kind of insecurity it certainly doesn't stop people from loving others, but I think it does present some unique challenges for a successful relationship. Because what happens with that kind of insecurity, it can be very difficult to get out of. So folks with low self-esteem, when their partner does something really nice for them or maybe pays them a compliment, they're less inclined to really embrace that and rather be like, oh, why are they saying this? Do they really mean it? Do they just feel bad for me? Do they pity me? That kind of thing. Whereas when there's some kind of negative event that maybe even has nothing to do with a low self-esteem person, say you had a bad day and you're in a bad mood, and so you're a little bit harsher with your partner, or you've forgotten an important date, but it's just your mind's all over the place, right? You just forgot. But those kinds of potentially negative behaviors, the low self-esteem folks can take, they'll tend to embrace those and take those in. So those kinds of things that minimizing their partner's positive behavior, but maximizing their partner's negative behavior can make it really difficult to break out of that insecurity. And then as a consequence of that, it can be difficult on the relationship in general, where there's a lot of reassurance seeking, a lot of, are you mad at me? Do you love me? Like, these kinds of questions can be draining for folks. And that's not to say that low self-esteem or insecure people don't have successful, rewarding relationships. They absolutely do. And a lot, I think, can depend on the partner. If they're with a partner who is relatively secure and patient and kind of understands where they're coming from and can be supportive, those relationships still can be very successful. I think it does help to be aware of some of those unique challenges in the way that low self-esteem people think about relationship behavior and interact with their partner. Uzma, can you add to that?
Yeah, those are really important points, Denise. And I think what I might add to that is that when someone may not have a lot of self-acceptance or even self-understanding, they may not feel able to bring up their needs. So either they're not aware of their needs or they dismiss their own needs. So I think in that way, the issue that one partner has is going to become a relational issue. And the other thing is that people who may be insecure, more insecure in themselves, or feel more, I mean, the way I think about it is like more shame-based or more highly self-critical, that they're not as disclosing. So the idea of like coming back to being open or taking risks in the relationship and being able to be wrong or be mistaken or say or kind of do the wrong thing, they'll be more worried, people who are more critical of themselves. And so I think in that way, it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of the very thing that people fear they make happen in their relationship, and not, you know, explicitly, but just implicitly. And but I also think there's a lot of hope for addressing those issues through work on the self or therapy and other means like that. So yeah.
Okay, we have a few more topics we want to get through, but I'm gonna take a little pause and just try and get through some more of these questions here. There's a couple I've seen here about media. So one, how accurate do you feel media reflect real relationships? And there was an earlier question, again, yeah, what influence that media might have? Anyone want to take that one?
I mean, I'll take a stab at one part of that, okay, because right now my students and I are studying sexual consent. And I find that that's an area where I'm really disappointed by media portrayals. And that a lot of times when there is sexual chemistry or any kind of sexual behavior that is shown in popular media, I don't think the idea of consent is really is part of that, or it's rarely part of that. And I would love to see that change.
Yeah, good one. Yeah, Toni.
Sorry, media is a mixed bag. It really depends on what you watch and what year. Really, right? So what I'm appreciating about media more recently is an increase in representation of diverse ways of being in relationship, diverse gender and sexuality. It's beginning to, it's a change in the right direction. Whereas at one time, I mean, I've been teaching for, I don't know, long time. And in the early years, I remember one of the issues that students and I would talk about is lack of representation in media for anyone other than cisgender heterosexual folks. And of course, all relationships were monogamous. And if there was any casual sex, it was villainized in some way, or it was very much accepting for cis men to want sex, but not for cis women to want sex. So over the years, that has begun to change in the right direction. Like I said, increase in diversity. I mean, we're not there yet, but I appreciate that that change at least has begun. So that people can see themselves in media more regularly. There are still, sadly, we're seeing I think, perpetuation of those gender and sexual stereotypes that, you know, have been around for decades. And a recent study, I think 2018 or so, took a look at those stereotypes and said, do they still exist? And among young people, they do. So I know students in my class are really surprised. They say, no, come on, that's the old days. Well, I look at them and I say, well, your peers are saying that they're still in effect. So this is not the old days. So some movement has been made, but we still have a whole ways to go. And when we talk about sexuality and relationships in later life, I can talk a little bit, I think, about media representation of older people and sex and what that looks like.
Okay, thanks. Question here. Do you think the pandemic has fast-tracked people's relationships? I know a lot of people moving in much quicker with their partner or getting engaged. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine when loneliness is heightened, as it has been for so many people, and you do find someone that seems appealing. Any other thoughts, Toni or Uzma, on that one?
I don't know a lot of the hard data evidence on that, but just what I've been reading from like anecdotal stories or news reports is that that is the case. And so I think what's going to be really interesting is in the next 2 years, we're going to get a lot more information about what happened during this period. But anecdotally, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I was speaking to both of you about the idea of like wintering together. And we're talking about how COVID, especially as winter hit, people on dating sites were much more quicker to find a partner and winter with them because they didn't want to be alone during COVID winter.
Yeah. Right. If you're single and you've got to limit your contacts, then okay, you're going to pick one person and go with that. And yeah, Toni.
Well, I wonder, because I learned from my students last winter, they teach me, that's a phenomenon actually that's been happening for a while among younger people, that they are connecting over the winter months, so the holidays, so to not spend the holidays and the winter months alone. And then come spring, they break up, and then, all the layers come off and out they go looking for something new. So I wonder if this is sort of a more acute kind of version of that. But you're right. I think we'll see, right? We'll see once we pass this stage.
Actually, one of the participants, Caitlin, talked about this American Life episode on wintering, and that's the one I heard and really enjoyed. So people who want to do like more of a deeper dive into this, they might want to listen to that episode.
Okay. Question: how important is physical attractiveness in online dating? I mean, I think you could certainly ask that about dating in general. Anyone want to take that one?
It depends. It depends on you. I mean, how important is physical attractiveness for you? My sense of the literature in online dating, though, and is that physical appearance is ranking pretty high on the list in the online domain in particular. And my understanding from the literature is that physical attractiveness is also quite significant in gay men's dating apps as well. So yeah, so yeah, I've got nothing else. That's what I got.
I would just say that, yeah, it's one of the things that in various dating scenarios people will say is like that they'll make their decisions based on who they find physically attractive. But we know that, I mean, that's not something that necessarily predicts relationship longevity. And probably a lot of people have had the experience where someone they met that initially they're like, nah, and then they get to know them and really like them, and that attractiveness grows over time. Physical attractiveness is not just about objective beauty.
Yes.
Right.
Well said, Denise.
Okay, thank you. One person says, I'm finding that I'm swiping left on people. Which is left? Is that good or bad? I don't know. It's bad. Swiping left on
bad,
people,
right?
Too attractive, where they don't seem like your real profile, says one person here. Yeah, that's interesting. I think, I mean, that's one of the things that or a concern that can come up with online dating as well. Like, what are people? I mean, even if we meet people in person, we try and craft our image in a certain way that's going to be more appealing. But there's lots more image crafting online in general, right? And so you don't necessarily know what you're going to get with that.
Yeah. And actually that emerged as quite a concern for many respondents in my study, that they were very concerned about misrepresentation online. And, references to catfishing, but even just more minor representations. The literature suggests that in terms of misrepresentations online, they tend to gravitate around misrepresentation of in photos, so younger photos and photos where people look slimmer than they do in real life. So that body image stuff, that was the most prominent, one of the most prominent things that was misrepresented online. At the end of the day, I would say, I think that we need to move somewhat cautiously in terms of trying to get to know people, before we decide to see them in person. And again, when we see them in person, safety is really important, right? So meet in a public place, not at your home. And there are no guarantees when we meet people in person that they are who they say they are, but we're just adding information, right? We're collecting data, and then we're going to get a sense of, how do I feel about this person?
Yeah. Yeah, I had a friend who was dating online and using an app that it connects with your other social media, and it showed her that this person was a mutual friend. This person was a friend of mine, and so she showed me the profile. She said, "Oh, do you know this person?" I said, "Oh yeah, yeah." And she said, "Oh, his dog is so cute." And I said, "He doesn't have a dog. He would." Guaranteed, someone told him that if you put a picture of yourself with a dog, it'll be more attractive to women. So he wasn't lying. He never claimed it was his dog, but there's all these little ways, right? But certainly some are more dangerous. And I see there was a comment here. Having a few dates that made them put them in danger, made them feel unsafe. And there is a shift from Tinder to Bumble, which is a different site where ladies message first. And so it's not, the women aren't bombarded by all these people who are interested in them, but can be a little bit more selective. And so that's one way of handling that issue. Yeah. So another question here. So she wrote, dog baiting is very real. I didn't know her name. Awesome. Okay. A question here with the COVID, and I think we had a little bit more that we were going to say about COVID situation as well. But the question is, as much as there are couples fast tracking their relationships during COVID, do you think there are just as many romantic couples that are breaking up due to the long distance now? And so I looked into that a little bit, and but Uzma, why don't you go ahead first on that one?
Yeah. So should I go into the
COVID? Yeah.
The COVID question. Yeah.
So the question is, COVID brought couples together or driven them apart?
Yeah. And so I think like when we sort of think about what are the different possibilities. So if as a couple is going through COVID, they could be able to like either maintain their relationship quality, keep it steady to pre-pandemic levels, or they can increase their relationship satisfaction, or that the relationship satisfaction really declines and they become unhappy and the relationship becomes unstable. And so what the evidence seems to suggest is that people are either able to maintain or their relationship is declining. There aren't a lot of people who are falling into that middle category of relationship satisfaction increasing. And really to understand the impact of COVID, I think the literature that I find really helpful to think about is the chronic stress literature. And what the chronic stress literature tells us is that as you have people who are experiencing disruptions in different domains of their life, their ability to engage adaptively in the relationship. So like in all relationships, there's going to be rupture, and then you do a repair of a rupture. You make allowances for your partner, you validate, you show up for them, you're responsive to them. That under periods of stress, the capacities to do those things really diminish, and they can diminish and they impact relationship quality overall. When you stress an organism enough, whether that organism is an individual or we think of the couple as an organism, the effects of that stress are going to show up. And so now there are actually really some new studies that are coming out that are around COVID and have gathered data from relationships. And what we find is that who is most vulnerable? People who already had vulnerabilities going in. So these vulnerabilities we can think about at a few different levels. So people who had contextual vulnerability. So they were socioeconomically less advantaged, less privileged. And so they experienced minority stress, systemic racism. So those types of contextual vulnerabilities, when they're there, the impact of the COVID stress was greater. Then we also think about pre-existing mental health vulnerabilities as well as pre-existing relationship vulnerabilities. Your relationship is already struggling. those are the people where there have been pre-existing mental health issues, or there are already pre-existing relationship issues, that we find that the ability to cope has been less and the ability to adapt has been less. It's really an issue of like both at the level of psychological resources and physical resources, rich getting richer and poor getting poorer. And we really need better interventions and support at the social level, because this is not an equal pandemic, and it is not at the relationship level either. Yeah.
Absolutely. I was thinking about it too, in terms of stress, as you said, and that support piece is interesting, because we often in relationships, when one partner may be undergoing a stressful situation at work and the other partner can support them, but in so many things that are happening right now, the stress is on like it's a mutual stress or a shared stress, whether the children at home, the financial situation, separation from their larger family network. And so it can be really extra difficult for people to get support from their partner, whose own struggles are preventing them from being as supportive as they usually can be. Also, I think in terms of the time spent together has something that has really changed. And I think, it potentially beneficial for some folks who didn't spend a lot of time together, and now are maybe working from home, and all these other events in their lives and commitments have sort of dropped away. They can maybe spend more time together, but then you get, for a lot of people, it's too much togetherness, right? So it's kind of the very things that are benefit for some are challenges for others, right? And even with that, I kind of wonder if some couples, what might happen is they tend to hide behind busyness, I think, for some people, and people start to grow apart or feel a bit disconnected, but they can blame, our lives are so busy. We run from work to this event and to kids' soccer practice and this and that. And now when those things drop away and they're left with nothing else but this person in front of them, they're like, wow, who are you? And like, who did I marry? And who are we? And for some couples, that can potentially galvanize a refreshing of the relationship, whereas for others, it might have a more negative impact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, next question about older folks. Toni, you're going to take this one. Is it true older people don't have active sex lives?
No, it is a myth. Absolutely a myth. So I think it's important to think about, when we say sex lives, right? What does that mean? And when we think about sex, we're not, this is not just penetrative. Why can't I say the word? Penetrative. Okay. Penetrative. I can't say this word.
Penetration.
Thank you. It's not just about that. So when I teach and I talk about sex, I say that, that's all kinds of sexual activity, right? All forms of, kissing, touching, and caressing, and penile vaginal intercourse, and oral sex, and anal sex, and all kinds of stuff. So the reality is that most older folks, many, have the need for touch. And when we think about later in life, lots of losses happen around partners passing and friends passing, and being geographically separated from perhaps friends and family. The opportunities for touch also decrease dramatically. In terms of, so touch being one part of sexual activity that is really important to many, many people, right? Folks, aside from folks who are asexual. Later in life, the research suggests that folks who have an interest in sexual activity in their younger years, that doesn't necessarily just disappear when they hit a certain age. So folks, you need to know that when you hit 50 or whatever that magic number is in your head, no, things do not turn off. What we do know is that there is a gradual decline in desire for sexual activity, but we see that the age at which generally that begins to manifest more clearly is around 75. So I don't know what's in your head about what older people look like, but those in the, 50 to 75 range that some might consider older, they can still absolutely be sexually active in whatever sex means to them. The research also says that aside from age, the other factor that's a very significant determinant of sexual activity in later life is attitudes. Attitudes predict desire also in earlier life as well as in later life. And so basically, what are your attitudes towards sexuality? Sexuality in relationship, outside of relationship, so casual versus committed, or in certain cases in a married context. That will impact your desire later in life. And the other reality is presence of a partner. We may have an interest in sexual activity, but if we don't have access to a partner, there's solo sex and there's masturbation, of course, but partnered sex may become, it's not about desire, it's about access, right? And not having people to engage with. So that could be problematic. The other pieces obviously around stigma. I often, when I teach about sexuality in later life with students, and I ask them, what comes to mind when you think about older people and sex, and some of the myth, like the stereotypes. And, people don't want to think about their parents having sex, let alone their grandparents having sex, right? And the reality is that there's still an interest and it still does happen, but media representations don't help either. So we have media representations of men in later life. If they are interested in sex, we call them dirty old men, right? And things of that nature. So we're not setting things up well for people later in life to have healthy sexual relationships with partners. The other piece that I think people sometimes forget, I did a little talk for folks who were training in nursing and physiotherapy and other health services domains at McMaster one year. And I brought up sexual activity in long-term care facilities. And the young people were just shocked. They're like, well, what do you mean? Well, folks, they're not dead. There's still an interest in being connected physically, and the kind of intimacy that comes from that, right? For many folks may still want that. The other piece that folks seem to be surprised about was that there could be folks in long-term care facilities who were interested in same-sex partnerships and same-sex activity. And the young people were just shocked to even think about that. Well, folks, if we have, folks who belong to the queer community in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, that's not going to change in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. So we need to sort of be prepared for that. Representation of LGBTQIA2+ folks in later life around sexuality in media is this big, right? Compared to folks in their 20s. So when I said that there's an increase in media representation around diversity and sexuality, yes, that's increasing, but mostly we see that targeted towards younger demographics and far less for older demographics. Similar with heterosexual encounters, the ratio of younger to older is far greater in media. So those are a few of the things that I wanted to say about that. But if anyone's watching, needing to Netflix binge, and there's this show called Jane the Virgin. And look, I don't belong to I have no production rights or anything like that. And I never thought that I would watch it, but I stumbled upon it one day, and it's literally like a telenovela. So it's poking fun at soap operas of a certain kind. But I'm amazed at how they're representing sexuality in later life. And a, strict Catholic woman who believes in no sex before marriage and is widowed and is considering, herself as a sexual being again. And it's wonderful that this is giving some permission, right, in the media, but these representations are limited.
Yeah, great to see when they're there, though.
Yeah.
Okay, we've just got about 10 minutes left here. I want to get to a couple more of these questions. Two sort of related here. Any advice about returning to dating after divorce, particularly a painful, complicated divorce, or advice for dating when you were a parent, or anything we know about these situations?
I think in terms of returning to dating after divorce and a painful, complicated divorce, I think what would be really important is that the feelings around the divorce have had a chance to be processed and accepted and understood, and that there has been a sense of, self-compassion from that journey and that experience. Because I think what we do see from, at least I see it in my clinical work and clinical writing, is that the wounds that aren't processed, they show up again and again. And so I think that's why I think that's quite important.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily about waiting a particular amount of time. I think about this for folks who've been widowed too. There's no right time after a divorce or being widowed to start a new relationship. It's a lot about kind of where you're at emotionally, what's been resolved or not.
Yeah, I don't think it's a certain amount of time, because some people have stayed in the marriage long after they have wanted to leave. And so within the marriage, they've already processed the loss of the marriage. So for those people, like they may be at a stage where they can really start dating immediately. And for other, it's really about like where you are with your processing, I see. I think of.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Toni, do you have anything to add to that?
Just very well said, Uzma. I agree completely. The other piece is around, when children are in the mix, and that complicates things a little bit. I think it also depends on the children's experience of the divorce and what co-parenting looks like. And so there are a number of other factors, I think, to pay attention to in terms of the child's well-being. And it's, if you're at a place where you're ready to sort of experiment and explore, exploration are great. As a family therapist, I would say, maybe that the kids can be involved after some of that exploration has settled a little bit, right? Just to keep things a bit more stable for children who don't know how to make sense of all these changes that are happening in their lives.
And I would add one other thing to that, is that people consistently seem to underestimate the complexity of blended families. That blended families and handling emotions and different alliances that are within those blended families is an area that I think we're starting to appreciate and we're starting to look at, but it seems really important to go slow and to really kind of see how every member of that bigger relationship or the commitment is doing in it. Yeah, blended families are not for the faint of heart.
Yeah. I see a couple more questions here about dating, attraction, resources for neurodiverse individuals. And that's something the library can send. We can gather some of those, and the library can send them out to registrants for those who are interested. And we're here. Well, I don't know how to answer this. It made me laugh a little bit, though. Does being on the opposite ends of the political spectrum or having different views on events and figures mean the relationship is doomed? I was thinking about being with someone on the opposite end of the spectrum. I'm like, ooh, that would be challenging. I don't know any research on that, but I would think of it like, any kind of difference. You're going to be opposite on some kind of trait or belief or preference in some way. And like anyone, there's that communication about it, the respect for those differences, and maybe trying to not change your partner, like we sort of talked about before, not trying to make your extroverted partner introverted or not trying to make your liberal partner conservative, but just finding ways to sort of honor that and communicate about that. Yeah.
I think the other complexity there is that the political divide is so great right now.
Yes.
So I think if we were thinking about many decades ago and there was a lot more people in the center or close to the center, and now when you think about the opposite end of the political spectrum, it's not just politics, it's about identity, racism, ideologies that suggest that some people are inherently more inferior to others. So those come to some core human values. And I think I would find it really hard to go to an extreme where I would not share those values with someone. But I think in a different time, and maybe we'll all heal through this process, and fast forward 20 years, you don't get such extremes. And then it's a different, when we're thinking about political differences, we're talking about a different phenomena than we are right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So another question here, kind of going back to what we discussed earlier about the soulmate idea. Is this even a desirable construct that one person can be or should be a soulmate, a best friend, a lover, everything to life? Toni, what is your answer? He's shaking her head, I think.
Toni is looking for her quote that she was going to read earlier. So Esther Perel, if you haven't read Esther Perel and you're interested in this stuff, good book to read on my bookshelf. But I'll share with you one quote. This one always stands out for me, and I read it to students when I teach the dating course. She says, marriage was an economic institution in which you were given a partnership for life in terms of children and social status and succession and companionship. But now we want our partner to still give us all these things, but in addition, I want you to be my best friend and my trusted confidant and my passionate lover to boot. And we live twice as long. So we come to one person and we basically are asking them to give us what once an entire village used to provide. Give me belonging, give me identity, give me continuity, but give me transcendence and mystery and all in one. Give me comfort, give me edge, give me novelty, give me familiarity, give me predictability, give me surprise. I don't have it in me, folks. I cannot be all those things to someone. So if you equate soulmate with giving you everything you need, then I think that we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, because we cannot give our partners everything they need. The key, I think, in relationship is identifying what's at the high part of your hierarchy. What are the things that you most need? And are you aligned in those areas? And do you have other people in your life where you can get some of those others' needs filled? I like to tell long, detailed stories. When I tell a story, I want the person to be able to imagine themselves in the situation with me. I love my partner dearly, but he is not oriented to storytelling in the same way. That's okay, because it's not super high on the list, and I have other people who satisfy that need.
Toni, we have to get together more.
Always listen to your stories, Toni. Always.
My husband doesn't like long stories either. I'll listen to your stories, Toni. You listen to mine.
See, I've got people.
Yeah.
I don't need one. I need a village.
Yeah, absolutely. The more we can rely on our friends and family to meet, to do activities with that our partner doesn't like to do, to, help us regulate emotions. Like if your partner's not someone who's good at soothing your anxiety, you can find a friend who is, right? Putting all that pressure on the one person, absolutely, I think sets us up for disappointment and failure. And our lives are just better in general, the more stronger relationships we have beyond our partner as well. Toni, someone's asking the name and author of that book. It's Esther Perel. Which book is it? It's Mating in Captivity. Can you see that? Mating in Captivity? Yeah, it's a pretty good one. I was looking through it today and I realized I underlined a lot of pieces. I think I need to reread it. All right. Well, I think we're at the end of our time here. I'm sure we could go on a lot longer, but I think Nancy will come along and close us out here. So thank you, everyone. This has been really fun. I'm sorry we couldn't keep up with all the questions. Yeah. But yeah, we'll try and send out some resources. And yeah, you have our information as well if you want to follow up on anything. Yeah. Thanks for having us, Nancy. Yes, thanks for hosting. This was lovely. And thank you, Uzma and Denise. It was really a good time. It just seemed like it was the three of us chatting. There's all these folks in the background. Yeah. So I hope I hope everyone got something anyway, some kind of nugget that was useful for them to take away.
So thank you guys. Thank you, everybody. That was really interesting. Thank you for sharing with us all the research and really, really good information. What we're going to do is any resources that get sent along to me, I will forward it to all of the registrants. Also, if Dr. Serafani can forward me the name of the book and the author, I'll put that in an email as well and have that sent out to you guys. We want to thank Renison University College for this partnership, and thank you, everybody. Have a good night. WPL.ca for any upcoming programs that we might have. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Bye.